with which we begin our day here at the Rajan Khilachand Mughal tent. The first session, which is number 72, is titled The Lands Where I Flee. We will have Benjamin Dix, Ma Thida, Prajwal Parajuly, and Lucy Hugh-Hallet, who will be in conversation with Amitava Kumar. It's a lovely panel to start off the day with. Amitava Kumar, who will be moderating the session, will introduce the rest of our panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel.
I've never attended a panel so early at JLF ever, so you should give a round of applause for me, but also for yourself for waking up so early and being here. Thank you so much. What I'm going to do, instead of in a boring manner introducing all of the folks who are on this panel together, I'll just introduce each individual speaker as they talk a little bit, as they either read or share with you their work. The first person sitting to my right is Benjamin Dix. He's a photographer, communication manager. He began his career as a professional at the United Nations, and after having served with the UN through the conflict in Sri Lanka, he turned to the lighter matter of comics. But these comics are not necessarily ha ha ha. They explore serious political and social issues, and which includes refugees and migration. His firm, do you call it a firm or would you call it organization? Creative enterprise is called PositiveNegatives, and each comic has reached over 2 million viewers around the world of all ages. So we'll start with Benjamin, who will show you a short animated clip. Benjamin, you want to give them the secret signal?
No time to say goodbye. Tranquil landscape, no warning. No time to say goodbye. Home is no longer a place to rest my head. A stampede like the devil's scorn ripped apart my world. I heard them scream. They were screaming. And so my journey begins. Walking for 10 hours in the darkest of nights, starlight paved our way into the borders of Ethiopia. I am one of many. Blistered hands and feet remind me I'm still alive. But this is no stopping ground. I hear folk tales of a promised land, of the free, paved in gold and opportunity. A safe passage for me is all I seek, access to a world I can rest my head and rise up in one piece. So, into the abyss. Eyes opened, yet blind as a bat. Belly of the beast is not how they described breathe. Oh God, I don't know how to swim. Work it out, hold tight, hold your breath. One down, oh God, this is not my time, hold tight. Her last words echo in my mind. Run, in water and sand, just run. I blink, feet running, I blink, feet running, I blink. We were 51, now 32. 10 moons on dry land, and en route we lose 1. 3, 6, 7. At the doors of Libya, at the mercy of new hands. I am one of 6. Like Mother Earth, surrounded by parasites, they looted me like they did our village. I survived that. I will survive this. Saw the devil take my brothers, and against all odds, I'm still breathing. Only a piece of me died. Feet keep moving past the Dead Sea on dry land. My will, unwavering, holding on to the only possession I keep, hope, guided me through the hot sands of Khartoum and now Calais. Hope, like a north star in the darkest of nights. Hope, my compass for survival. Hope, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Hope, quenched my thirst in the muddy jungle. 1, 2, 3, go.
Illegal alien.
It's an epidemic. Go back to your country.
Do you speak English?
Now, miss, please tell me your circumstance. the mercy of new hands, I sit in purgatory, whilst gatekeepers dissect my tongue in search of a truth beyond what was. Of course I look older than I achieved. So I feel my North Star's fading. 8 months. My North Star's fading. Can't move, can't run. Incrementing. Please don't kill me. Regard meditate, Madenga. My tranquil lands gave no warning, no time to say goodbye.
Thank you. Benjamin, we'll come back to you. What we'll do is just have everyone share a little bit of the work and then we'll discuss. Seated to my extreme left is Lucy Hughes-Hallet. She's a writer. Lucy has written a biography of Gabriel D'Annunzio. It's called The Pike. It won all 3 of the UK's most prestigious awards for non-fiction. Her novel, Peculiar Ground, has been acclaimed for its compelling storytelling and the light it sheds on urgent contemporary issues of migration and exclusion. Lucy, would you mind reading a little bit?
I'd be happy to. My novel is set in 2 different periods. The central part of the book is set in the 20th century and has a lot to say about the Berlin Wall. But the first and last parts of the book are set in the 1660s in England. And this passage I'm going to read is from the year 1665, which was the year of the Great Plague, when nearly a quarter of the entire population of London died of bubonic plague. And this passage describes desperate people trying to escape from the city and find refuge in the countryside. The narrator is, well, it doesn't really matter who he is, actually, but he is making a journey through southern England, and he's finding the roads clogged with these people fleeing from danger. Several times today, I have refused extravagant sums of money offered me for my good Bess. She is a dependable horse, but 2 months ago, I could scarcely have got the price of a saddle for her. For the past week, though, it has been impossible to come by a horse or even a donkey within 20 miles of London. It strikes me that for one who does not scruple to feed upon the despair of others, a calamity like the one now upon us creates fertile ground for the flourishing of a fortune. As I breakfasted this morning, the publican told me, "I'll take no more travellers this season. You, sir, are the last." The morning was warm, but the fire in the room was banked up as though to fumigate it. He stood by the door and kept his head averted as he spoke. Good weather is unwelcome. There are those who believe that the sun heating the ground draws the infection into the air. The walkers who fill the main road westward as the spring thaw fills a river hamper their own progress in their attempts to protect themselves. Already faint, they wrap kerchiefs across their mouths and noses. Breath, the very essence of life, is feared as a poison. A young matron walked ahead of me. Her man was pulling a handcart laden with blankets and other stuff, a baby riding atop the heap. An old man was with them, now grasping the sides of the cart for support, now leaning on the woman, whom I took to be his daughter. The marching column seemed to check. The people around me paused, and as others came up behind, they began to stumble over each other. There was shouting. Ahead, across the road into the village, I saw a barricade made of tree trunks and furze branches. The travellers were too listless to attempt to force their way in, but I saw some men in livery standing before the obstruction with staves in hand. They watched silently as the travellers cast about, then passed by the village along a muddy path that circled it. When the family in front of me arrived at the division of ways, the husbands set down the handles of the cart and leading the older man by the arm, walked steadily towards the barricade. Stopping at a discreet distance, he called out loudly, "Will no one have pity on these white hairs? My father is too feeble for more journeying. Will no one take him in?" He then coaxed the old man, who seemed to have no will of his own left, to sit himself upon a low wall bounding a garden plot, and leaving him there, went back to his wife and child. "In God's name," he called out in a great voice, "show that you are the sons of that God whose quality is ever to have mercy." His wife was weeping. He took up the cart handles again, and chivying her on, went along the side road, looking back repeatedly as he went. The men at the barricades stood like statues. And then the narrator travels on, reaches his destination, which is the park around a great house in rural England. As I rode up the drive, one part of my mind was marveling at the luxuriance of the trees I had planted 3 years earlier. Another part was writhing under the painfulness of the scenes I had witnessed. If, as some believe, this plague is a trial sent to find out who amongst the living is deserving of salvation, then I do not think I will have passed muster. Selfish, I told myself, cowardly, weak. I should have given up my horse.
Thank you. You know, this panel is on the literature of migration and exile. And so, if you've been following the news for the past year, 2 years, 3 years, it's quite proper that our next reader is from Burma. Let me read out a brief introduction to Thida. She's a writer, a surgeon, and a human rights activist. Thida is a Burmese former prisoner of conscience. She was awarded several international human rights awards, including the Reebok never read from the phone. The Reebok Human Rights Award, the Penn Barbara Goldsmith Freedom to Write Award, the Freedom of Speech Award, and Vaclav Havel's Courageous Writer at Risk Award. Thida was elected as the first president of PEN Myanmar in late 2013 and was elected as one of the board members of PEN International in 2016. Please, Thida.
I'm going to read from my documentary fictions. It's called The Roadmap, that was published under a pseudonym as soon as it was published, but then we published under my name. And this book is kind of the experimental writing, and it has 7 chapters, and every chapter has a set of the series of monologues. The atmosphere is to explain the situation, and the travelers is the internal monologue of one of the characters in this. I'm going to read 2 passages from one atmosphere and the one traveler. Atmosphere, 1997. The train platforms are busy with commuters, vendors, porters, and people waiting to pick up or meet passengers. The winter sun glows clearly at noon. The platform floors are patchy with beater blood, dog shit, and unidentified stains. The benches are mostly occupied by beater sellers and vegetable tempura vendors. Some porters are carrying huge cane baskets filled with spicy chilies, big condensed milk containers, and luggage. Water sellers are running to and from the passengers. Noisy whistling from the police stuns people on the platform. A long, low siren alerts the greeters. A whistle is blown. A green flag waves. An ancient engine dragging some renovated carriages approaches the station. Hundreds of windows slowly pass by before the train stops. Faces, white, yellow, black, familiar, strange, smiling, and anxious, also pass by in the coach windows. One coach looks like a mail carriage. Iron mesh and metal bars covers its 2 windows. Shadows of heads bob inside, without enough light inside the coach. The greeters cannot make out the faces of those inside. The eyes of the people inside seem to spot faces of their family members or friends who will greet them there in the open air, with noses pressed flat against the iron mesh, their heads crushed against each other at the only windows. Travelers, what a terrible scene, tragic, full of humiliation. How can I find words that express my feelings at this moment? I'm numb. No, my emotion is so strong it's about to burst out. Feeling beyond utmost feeling. Not only numbness, but also intense awareness. Look at my father. It was my dream to see him in the open air. Now look at my Pepe, my father, in the open air. Look at him. Look at you. Look at you in the open air. Your dry gray and black hair is cut short and looks like a dusty bush on a shaved mound. Your ever bright eyes have changed and now have a mysterious look. Your usual neat and tidy looking clothes have been replaced by a worn-out, crinkled, yellowish-white prison uniform. Your once straight posture has now changed into that of a Burmese puppet without its strings. Though you are wearing your famous smile, I can see your baffled mood. Are you my father? Are you my Pepe? Please feel what we are feeling. A father is standing in the open air in front of his daughter, but they are separated by barriers and burdens. Please don't say a word to reassure me. I'm sure no one could find the words to express the way I feel unless they had experienced the same thing.
Thank you. And last but first, Prajwal Parajuly, who's the author of The Gurkha's Daughter, and if you think of the title of this panel, he's the author of the novel Land Where I Flee. Prajwal is also a judge of the 2017 International Dylan Thomas Prize. I'll ask Prajwal to read from his work, but following that, I'd also like him to talk a little bit about the title of his novel, which has given the name to this panel, just to set the stage for further discussion. Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amitava. I'll read a short extract from my collection of short stories, but to make sense of the extract, I'd have to give you some context, so I hope that's okay. Many of us are familiar with Bhutan. We think of it as the lost Shangri-La. We think of it as this lovely Buddhist place. You know, we think of gross national happiness and marvel at the amazingness of the concept. What a lot of us do not know is that Bhutan has been responsible for one of the most severe ethnic cleansing experiments in modern times. More than 106,000 Nepali-speaking people have been ejected from the Bhutanese borders since the 1980s. Why? Partly because a lot of them are Hindus, whereas Bhutan is primarily a Buddhist kingdom, and partly because what happened next door in Sikkim, my home state in India. Sikkim was annexed by India in 1975. For what people believe happened because of the Nepali-speaking majority in the state joining hands with India to throw the Tibetan origin monarchy. And Bhutan got extremely nervous and decided to kick 106,000 people out. Now, these people lived in a state of statelessness for 20 years on the India-Nepal border at refugee camps. They couldn't go back to Nepal because Nepal said, your ancestors have been gone far too long from Nepal for you to be Nepalese. They couldn't go back to Bhutan because they were not Bhutanese enough to be Bhutanese. So, yeah, there was a lot of languishing happening at the refugee camp, and The International Organization of Migration did help with the resettlement of a big number of these refugees. 75,000 of them have now been resettled in America. And this story in the Gurkha's Daughter is called No Land is Her Land. And it's about a Bhutanese refugee called Anamika, who has lived in a refugee camp on the India-Nepal border for about 15 years, doing nothing. Okay?
Cool.
Anamika considered the refugee camp at Kudnabari her home. She wasn't the kind to stare into the open space and sigh longingly for Bhutan. Her theory was simple. If her country, she still referred to Bhutan as a country even after all these years, did not want her, she did not want it back. She had long ago learned to let go. Of the 8 acres of land her family owned close to Phuntsholing, of the cousins left behind who scraped through the citizenship test that she, thanks to her husband, had failed, and of the food, anointed with copious amounts of cheese and hot peppers, that she never quite succeeded in replicating since she came to Nepal as one of the 106,000 ethnic Nepali refugees forced out of Bhutan. Kudnabari wasn't all that different from Phuntsholing. The people looked alike, spoke Nepali with the expected variance in inflection, and followed the same religion and customs. The Bhutanese refugees at the camps often declared that they had done a better job of preserving the Nepalese culture than the Nepalese people themselves. Despite living in such familiar surroundings, most refugees she spoke to were hoping for repatriation, unlike Anamika. She had had it with Bhutan. Her daughter's repetition of Dzongkha letters should have brought back memories, but it didn't. It was as though the girl were parroting English nursery rhymes, nothing more. Anamika felt no stirrings in her heart, as the camp folks often claimed, no sentiment for a country that was once her home. She had wasted a dozen years of her life at the camp. Back in Bhutan, she had at least been working, contributing to her family. Even after her marriage, she regularly deposited small amounts of money into her father's new Bank of Bhutan account. Her husband probably didn't notice because he was too busy enticing every Nepali-speaking Bhutanese within reach to join the revolution. For her husband, the passion for the cause of the ethnic Nepalese came belatedly, years after the Bhutanese government had silenced the first murmurs of dissent. He had changed in a short time, not in his behavior toward her, for he was still affectionate, but in the way he interacted with people around him. He was constantly organizing, had little by little cut off the few non-Nepali speaking Bhutanese acquaintances from his life and stopped working together. I think that's fine. Thank you.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome to all those who arrived a little later than when we started. This is the panel on the literature of migration and refugees. When I was asked to moderate this panel, I said yes immediately because I was very much interested, I was curious about how literature responds to how writing of one sort or the other, particularly when it is fiction, responds to pressing social realities. And it seems to me that if an earlier moment might have been characterized as the century of migration, now we are more and more entering into the century of refugees. So I just want everyone to say a little bit about how do you read or interpret what has been in the news, whether we are talking about the Rohingyas or whether we are talking about the Syrian refugees. Do you think that is, would you agree that that is a pressing global reality that is only going to worsen in the years to come and we need to take stock of it? Who wants to go first? Oh, please,
okay,
Lucy.
I'll volunteer. In writing my novel, I've mostly written non-fiction, and this is the first fiction I've written. And one of the liberating things about fiction is that you can speak with many different voices and give different points of view. And that has allowed me to think about this issue both from the point of view of people who are driven out of their homes, who are exposed and in danger on the roads of the world, and also from the points of view of those who are settled and are very anxious about what these displaced people are going to do to their settled communities. And I think it's not a novelist's job to judge so much as to try to understand. And that passage I read earlier described people in great danger, people fleeing from London, where they were literally in danger of their lives, looking for safe refuge out in the countryside. And it also described the country people, very understandably, being terrified of these refugees. This was a time when people were dying of the bubonic plague. Nobody really understood how the infection was passed on. So villages would close themselves off. They would not build walls because they didn't have time to do that, but create flimsy barriers, and they would not allow the refugees from London into their safe spaces. And of course that was inhospitable, it was ungenerous. But I think that we have to look at both sides of this enormous problem, which, as Amitava says, is now a worldwide problem. That we all want a home. We all want to make ourselves a safe space where we can bring up our children, where we can be private with our family and our friends. And we have to think about how to reconcile that with the equally important impulse to welcome the stranger, to be hospitable, and to absorb people who are unable to stay in their own homes into our communities and allow them to flourish there.
Great. Next. Go.
So I work with, is this working?
Yeah, I think so.
I work with...
Can you hear him, Benjamin?
No? Shout?
No. They'll take care of it. Okay, bye. Oh, all right.
Someone else wants to go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thida?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, they can hear. Can you
Okay.
hear? If we speak a little bit, do a test.
Sure. I feel, yes, I have a big doubt. We are forward civilization or backward civilizations. And in these days, I almost feel the people on earth right now is doing the backward civilizations. We just do make more self-centered approach to contributing the current era to going nowhere by rejecting each other, not helping each other. This is very tragic story everywhere. So I really, I never decided to leave my country. That's why I never flee from my country, because I just told the others, because I want to change my country, I need to be in the country. But I can understand why people flee and why people cannot accept those people who fled, something like that. So there are some sort of the more self-centered approach towards humanity, and that's really make me disappointed in these days.
Okay. Benjamin, you want to go?
Try again?
Yeah.
Yes? Is that better?
Can you hear Benjamin this time?
Yeah. So I work in non-fiction. I work with people's testimonies, and the animation you saw there was a testimony of an Eritrean woman who had actually made 2 journeys. That animation is on a loop, so it plays again. Yeah. She made a journey to the UK. She was rejected. She was sent back to Asmara in Eritrea. She made the journey again at a cost of $40,000, and she was finally accepted, and now she lives in London. So I work very closely with someone like her to tell her story and use my space as a very privileged space to give her voice. And what we try and do with these kind of animations and comics and graphic novels that we write is to tell the background story to what someone like her has been through, that in the media it's portrayed as these people are coming as migrant workers, or the journey only really starts crossing the Mediterranean. Because journalists, it's very, very difficult to get into places like Khartoum, into Libya, into these refugee camps, into these prisons, really, in places like Libya, whereas through comics and animations, you can take the audience through that journey, and you can see these issues that actually crossing the Mediterranean is only one hurdle of many and many, many. But migration is much larger than that. It's not just about coming from Africa, Asia to Europe. Last week I was in Somalia and working on climate change issues where pastoral farmers are having continued drought due to climate change and are migrating from rural to urban Somalia. And the cities of Somalia are getting larger and larger and larger with these pastoral farmers coming in, and they start to reach breaking points. So what we try and do with this work that we're doing is really showing migration that, and it's not a new phenomenon. We've been migrating since the dawn of time. Humans move. But the stresses of population, of climate change, of internal conflicts are moving large quantities of people around. But what I'm trying to really do is tackle the media that I live in, unfortunately, Britain, which is dealing with Brexit at the moment, which is run on xenophobia and racism for people like this Eritrean woman, and to show that there are such forces in the world at the moment that people will move, whether it's for water, whether it's for food, or whether it's purely for safety to look after and educate their children. And it's to show that human narrative that someone's going through.
Great. Prajwal, you want to say something about your literature responding to something that is becoming a more and more pressing and pervasive issue?
Yeah. You know, in the course of researching for my books, I interviewed a number of people in America, a number of resettled refugees in America. So as I told you earlier, America has, I think, taken about 75,000 Bhutanese refugees, and they're planted in the whitest states of America. It's either Montana or Vermont. And a lot of these refugees are miserable there. I mean, a lot more miserable than they were at the refugee camps. In fact, there was a report in The Atlantic about how the suicide rate amongst Bhutanese in America was the highest among any ethnic groups. I don't know how the suicide rate is calculated, but if the average suicide rate in America is 12.9, the rate of the Bhutanese population is 20.3. And so, yeah, there's a lot of unhappiness there, a lot of misery, and I do not know what the solution to it is. A part of me naively thinks that if we lived in a visa-free world, all this wouldn't happen. And, you know, if there's one thing I could bequeath to my kids, it would be, I mean, there being no visas at all. I mean, the freedom to move wherever you want without the stigma of traveling from an inferior country to a superior country, or a troubled country to a stable country. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is that attainable? Maybe that we can address. Because we are at a literary festival, I hope you'll bear with me when I read a poem. It's by the Arab writer Naomi Shihab Nye. The poem's name is Red Brocade. I'll just read a few lines. The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's come from, where he's headed. That way, he'll have strength enough to answer, or by then you'll be such good friends, you don't care. So later on, you might want to Google that. It's The Red Brocade by Naomi Shihab Nye. I wanted to ask all of you, isn't one way that literature must engage with this issue is that of letting us better imagine the other not only as a marker of difference, but the other also as a welcome guest. Do you guys do that in your work, or do you struggle with that question, or do you want to say, that's not necessarily my job? I'd love to hear from you guys. Maybe you could say something?
Well, I once wrote an article saying that because of the other, our existence being acknowledged, our identity has been formed because of the others. Without the others, we cannot prove that we are here. So that's why I think the literature and freedom of expression is the key to make sure our identity has been existed. That's why I think for example, like the freedom of expression is the collective rights, not an individual rights. That's why we need to acknowledge the existence of the others in order to prove that our existence has been acknowledged.
All right.
So that's why I think literature, it's like, for me, literature is more or less about humanity.
Yes.
So literature has a bigger role in proving that the existence of ourselves or the other's identity via words and the thoughts.
Great. Lucy, maybe some thought?
Yes, I quite agree. It is one of the most important functions of literature, of reading, of writing, of festivals like this one, that we should be allowed access to other people's minds.
Yeah.
The minds of people who may have lived hundreds or thousands of years ago, people of different gender from us, different nationality, different age. My previous book was about Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was a brilliant Italian poet. So, you know, I salute his literary genius, but he was in many ways a horrible person. He was a very successful serial seducer who treated his women appallingly. One of his ex-lovers, after their affair had ended, wrote to him saying, "Dear poet, I imagine you're hoping that when you arrive in heaven, you will be met by a curious octopus-like creature with no head but the legs of 100 different women." So, you know, I'm a feminist. He's appalling to me in many ways, but I'm interested to know what made him think like that. And his politics, which he was a generation before Mussolini, but he was, as it were, an originator of Italian fascism. And his politics seemed to me so obnoxious that as I was researching and writing my book, I kept thinking, how can you think like that? And initially, perhaps that was just a rhetorical question, and then it began to seem to me a more and more interesting question, to try and put yourself into the mind of someone whose opinions you completely reject is a very useful exercise, I think. It's no good just saying, I don't like you, you're a baddie, you're on the wrong side. We have to try and understand each other.
Thank you. Prajwal, you want to say something?
Yeah, you know, as a person who... Can you hear me? No? Hello? Yeah, you know, as a person who has had a lifelong experience of being the other, you know, you grow up as a Nepali Indian in India, you're constantly having to stress on your nationality every time you mention your ethnicity. And as someone who went to school in Midwestern America, I have plenty of experience being the other. And to write about the other and to humanize it has been my goal in writing my books. If I am somehow able to engender compassion for the other, you know, because we are talking about the other in my books, I'd consider my mission a success. And, you know, it's very easy for us to, you know, sit in the comforts of our living room in our business class flights and whatnot and read about. Okay, I don't know where the hell I'm going with this, but...
I stopped at business class flights.
Sorry.
What I would like to ask are... Yeah.
Sorry. Just with othering, I found something that we do with our comics, which I try not to do with photography, is when you see a photograph of, for example, a Syrian refugee, the Syrian guy doesn't look like me. the skin is different, the religion is different, the clothes are different maybe, so there's a sense of othering. To put that story into a comic form breaks down that othering, that you see someone as an illustrated form and there's potentially more of a connection. But what I got quite upset about, especially with the Syrian issue at the moment, with so many Syrian refugees coming into Europe, was that they were portrayed in the media as extraordinary people. I kept reading this thing, that these Syrian refugees were extraordinary people. And I spent 2 months going around Eastern Europe interviewing Syrian refugees coming across the Balkans into Europe. And they weren't extraordinary people, they weren't other people, they were just people. And within those hundreds of Syrians that I interviewed, there were smart ones and funny ones and silly ones, and they were just people. And I found it quite patronizing to say that they were extraordinary because they were running away from war. We would all run away from war. That doesn't make us extraordinary. So to just tell their stories as human beings rather than putting this label that a refugee is something special, that's something that I wanted to break down, that othering, that they're not different, they're just people.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One question that I didn't warn my fellow panelists here that I would ask is to recommend a work about refugees, fiction or non-fiction, that you think we could just note down and read in the future. For me, if folks don't mind, I'm going to read another poem, a little section. The poet is a Somalian poet, Warsan Shire, who is a migrant to Benjamin's fair land, for many Indians, the home country. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats, the boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you. Fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burned threats into your neck. And even then you carried the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back. This is just a part of the poem. Warsan Shire. You can Google and read the rest. So would you guys mind performing the educational duty of supplying a title or two that you would like the audience or us to read?
Oh, well, there's something called Land Where I Flee, I hear. I mean, the author is a bit of a prick. Yeah, but it's a good book. Jokes aside, I think Exit West by Mohsin Hamid is one of the most extraordinary works describing the migrant refugee experience, and I think every one of you should read it. It's such a splendid book.
Lucy, what's your recommendation?
One of my all-time favorite novels, and it may seem rather surprising because it's, to mention it in this context, it's Charlotte Bronte's other masterpiece. Everybody knows Jane Eyre, but her other novel, her second great novel, she wrote some others, is Villette. And it's based on Charlotte Bronte's experience when she went to teach in Brussels, in Belgium. She wasn't a refugee, she wasn't homeless, she had a job to go to, but she arrived on her own in a foreign city, not really speaking the language, and she had to negotiate a culture with which she wasn't familiar. She was living in a Roman Catholic community. As a British person of that time, she was not only a Protestant Christian, but very anti-Catholic, as a lot of British people were. And so she felt she was surrounded by people of whom she disapproved on religious grounds, but she also knew that they looked down on her. And she had this great difficulty, which I think perhaps isn't talked about enough, of the language barrier. When you leave your own country, your own national group, you are silenced, you are dumb until you've made the huge and difficult effort of acquiring a new language. However clever you may be, people will speak to you as though you were an idiot because you just aren't yet articulate. And I love that novel for a great many reasons, but I think it is also very eloquent about the difficulty of being away from home and having to make a new life in a foreign place.
I'll turn to the other folks for their recommendations, but I want to tell the audience that soon it will be time for your questions. Maybe you'll have your own recommendations. Maybe you'll have other points that we have not touched upon that you want to ask the speakers. So, Benjamin, what's your recommendation, my friend?
To follow on from Lucy's idea of the perspective of someone when they've reached a destination or to another land, there's a book called What is the What by Dave Eggers, which is the story of one of the lost boys of Sudan who had to leave their home because of the Janjaweed coming in from Darfur and made a long journey across Sudan to Ethiopia, and then is a refugee in the US. But the book is written. Dave Eggers writes a lot of testimonial books, so he does similar work as I do with graphic novels and comics. But it's written from his perspective of this young boy's perspective of being a refugee in the States, looking back at his journey. And still he's on a journey of rediscovering himself and his identity and being in the US. And it's a fantastic book.
Thank you. Thida, do you have a recommendation?
Right now, I couldn't think any book yet. Yeah, still.
Maybe, how do we read what's happening in Burma right now? What should we read to get a good understanding of why the violence and the ethnic cleansing?
It's hard. Even for us, there is no truth or the right information we can get. It's very, very hard. Yeah, that's the problem.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, that magic moment has arrived when the audience finds a voice. So, do you have any thoughts, any questions? The lady in the third, fourth row.
Hi,
Nahi, awaaz nahi aa rahi.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nisha. I'm a UK-based journalist, and I've been covering migration and refugees for the past 5 years. And before I ask my question, I just want to recommend a book called The Optician of Lampedusa by Emma Jane Kirby, who's a BBC journalist. And it's one of the most amazing works on refugees and migration crisis.
Can you repeat the title? Holding the mic closer to your face.
The Optician of Lampedusa, written by a BBC journalist called Emma Jane Kirby. I highly recommend that book.
Thank you.
One of the... this point is a reference to what Benjamin mentioned about extraordinary people. I've been covering this issue, and I've spoken to a lot of refugees from Africa, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria. And there's one theme that has emerged repeatedly, and that is the black African refugees always tell me, this is what they've always told me, that there seems to be some kind of discrimination against them. So to put it in different words, they think some refugees are more equal than others. Syrians would get more exposure, importance, and even though we are trying to help these people, there might be an invisible bias against a different kind of refugee coming from Africa. I just want to know your thoughts. Thank you.
You want to respond to that, Ben?
Yeah, there are. I mean, policy is often media-led. I've done 10 years of work on Sri Lanka, and I was working in the north of Sri Lanka for 4 years through the conflict and wrote my PhD on the migration of Sri Lankan Tamils to Europe, who were hardly noticed compared to Syrian refugees. Syria is the media story, which is wrapped up in policy, it's wrapped up in oil, it's wrapped up in strategic influence for the West. Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Eritrea, Somalia isn't. It's a sexy story, and the Syrians get it. And at the moment, was living for a couple of years in Istanbul. You have Syrians coming through Istanbul, you have Iranians, you have Afghanis, you have Pakistanis, you have a huge amount of persecuted people. The Syrians are the ones who get the ticket to go to Europe, the Afghans, the Iranians, the Pakistanis don't. These things go in trends. At the moment, if you're, I mean, you can buy at the moment, I saw Iranian refugees buying Syrian ID cards for thousands of dollars, because you get a Syrian refugee ID card, you can go to Europe. So people are changing their identity in Istanbul to get to Europe. It's media-led.
Yeah, I would like to add something.
Please,
yeah,
please.
In Burma also, you know, the whole world just focusing on the refugee people, but we do have the internal displaced refugee camps all along Kachin State, Shan States, near to the China, and recently there was an airstrike attack in this area last 2 days ago. Some of the civilians has died, so and so. So these people, they are all also the minority. They also raise the question marks, who cares us? Sure. Nobody knows about us. We also are refugees. Yeah.
Somebody, let's take more questions. Somebody from this side? Maybe the gentleman right next to the microphone, yeah?
Thank you all for the work that you're doing. The question that I have is, given the rapid cycle of the news media, how can journalists build empathy more effectively, much like the work that you're doing in fiction and other forms of media?
You guys want to take that? Journalists rather than as fiction writers.
Well, I think journalists often are, some journalists are doing a terrific job. And there's a certain snobbery, I think, about the different status of book writers and journalists. I imagine the majority of the people speaking at this festival will have published books. But a lot of the best writers in the world have never published anything between hardcovers. They're writing for newspapers. Well, the difficulty, of course, is finding an outlet for what they have to say. The print press is shrinking all the time, and certainly in Britain, where I come from, when I was sort of starting out as a writer, you could quite easily place long, thoughtful pieces in the broadsheet newspapers or in the various news magazines. That's becoming harder. But of course, there is now the internet, where you can write to a much less easily contained readership. I mean, there are so many websites, and how do you get people to visit yours? I don't know. But that's one thing.
All right. Prajwal, you want to say something, or should we go to the next? Oh, one quick recommendation. For my students in my journalism class, I teach Svetlana Alexievich's Voices from Chernobyl. And I've heard her latest book is also wonderful. Just testimonies. And, you know, various people have spoken here about testimonial literature. The plain, unvarnished narratives of what you were calling ordinary people, who just give you a glimpse in their lives so that you see them as people and not as numbers or not as faces on your television screen. And I think that literature does an extraordinary job as journalism to produce a sense of understanding of the world. Someone else, the lady right in front here.
Morning, everyone.
Take it. That's cool.
Okay, I myself am a journalism student, and my question is that these refugees, they are believed to be very vulnerable, and as you said, there's a lot of misery, and they can be very easily radicalized. So they can be a threat to the internal security of the country. Like there were issues of when Rohingya refugees who are coming to India. So India's internal security was at stake. So what should the host countries, what measures should the host countries take to easily let them in, and also to protect the citizens and these refugees?
Okay, so because you're a journalism student, I want to ask you, how did you know, my dear, that the internal security of this huge country was threatened by the arrival of a few people who were fleeing and desperate for their lives? Tell me that. What were your sources of information?
I read it on the net, a few articles.
Yeah, hashtag fake news. But go ahead, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I saw it on the TV also, that there were some audio clips that were sent from Kashmir some terrorist groups from Kashmir, they sent some threatening audio clips to the news agencies that if you guys don't let these people in, we can,
Okay. Anyone wants to respond to that with a bit more insight than I did?
No. I mean, what's the security issue in India with Rohingyas? Rohingyas are fleeing to Bangladesh at the moment. There may be some Rohingyas which come through into India, but what's the problem?
Yeah.
I don't understand the question.
Maybe
sorry.
you've been watching Arnab Goswami.
I
don't think our republic is threatened.
What has happened? What has tangibly happened in India from the Rohingya? What has happened?
There's a hand at the back that way too, which we could take. A gentleman in the 10th row.
Sorry.
That's an answer. That's an answer. We have 5 more minutes. Keep your question short. Yep.
I'll tell you what's wrong with Rohingyas in India.
Thank you.
2 of them have been found in encounters in Kashmir. They are about 50 kilometers away from the LOC. They are into all kinds of peddling, narcotics, drug, gun running, extortion. They're running camps. That's what is wrong with Rohingyas in India. About 12,000 of them ended up in Kashmir, 3,500 kilometers away from Rakhine State, surreptitiously almost, in 2012-13. That's what is wrong with Rohingyas in India. Besides, in Kashmir, they are in Delhi, they are in Hyderabad, and these are some of the most sensitive areas in India, where communal cauldron just needs a matchstick. That's what is wrong with Rohingyas in India.
Okay, do you have a question, sir?
I have a question. You are discussing refugees. You have almost 500,000 refugees in your own country, here in India, for the last 29 years. You haven't even got a reference to them. And you're talking about all kinds of exotic destinations across the world discussing refugee problems. I wonder, how curious is that? Thank you.
I can't talk about India or Rohingyas because I'm a foreigner. But I know that in Britain there is a great anxiety that people coming into the country from Syria, from other places where it's too dangerous to live, will destabilize the host country, in this case Britain. And we have an insane rule that people who come into Britain are not allowed to earn their living. They're not allowed to work until they've been processed through the very slow-moving immigration office and given permission to stay and work in England. And that can take months, even sometimes years. I think one thing that can make those newcomers to a country less destabilizing for the host country is to make it easier for them to assimilate, to work, to support themselves, which most of them want to do. So rather than putting up barriers and greeting them with a kind of universal suspicion, I do think that we'll all be safer if there is a more kindly assumption that most of these people are here for genuine reasons and should be helped to reconstruct their lives.
We have 2 minutes left. India, do you want us to finish now? One more question, maybe. Let me also respond to a point that has been made there by saying the phenomenon of forced migration, refugees, is like the problem of global warming. When the seas will rise, they will not ask you whether you're a Hindu or a Muslim. You will lose your land. When the temperatures rise, they will not distinguish between black and white. When there's less oxygen, they will not say, oh, we'll pick up this child. We will leave that person to go free. And it is, if you think of that, then there is even greater danger in painting whole communities with, tarring them with the suspicion of being terrorists and of seeing their presence always as a threat. In fact, that's the worst response we can produce, and by quarantining them within our prejudices, we will only advance the threat of disruption and of tearing of the social societies. So last question. Please, lady here.
So my name is Nitan, and my country has recently passed laws against welcoming refugees. And I'm only in high school, but activism is very important to me, and in many forums that I'm in, we try to raise our voices in different ways, but often feel that we aren't heard. So I wanted to ask you if you have any ideas for maybe people who are younger of how we could be activists and make a change.
Never give up. Use Twitter, use Facebook, go crazy. Just don't give up.
Very good. Something else?
I think, yeah, we do need to clarify these groups of refugees from the political opportunists. You know, some people want to manipulate these kind of the people who's in despair. So we try to be very eye-open on who's in any cases. So then we can make the benefit of the majority people in despair, majority refugees in despair, and we need to separate them from the political opportunists. Otherwise, it's all very being complicated. That's why I think the humanities for the majority of people still should be established.
I've been asked to stop. Please join me in thanking my co-panelists here. They will be signing books, so the questions that you have, maybe you could address those when they are signing books. Thank you so much.